Well, Tony, I'm looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to do a bit of a deep dive on what the data is telling us about current trends in churches. And we're hitting this topic today in conjunction with the release of the newest Unstuck Church Report for the fourth quarter. So, Tony, we're calling this a special edition of the Unstuck Church Report. Why do you want to explain it that way?
Well, Amy, every edition of the Unstuck Church Report is
That's
special
right.
to me, but this one is especially timely for everyone listening today. And let me just share kind of the foundation for the report. Again, it's focused on surveys that we've completed and just recently. In fact, the survey data for this report was completed between late October and mid November. But we wanted to give some just a focused look to the current economic conditions that churches are facing as they're planning for their 2023 budgets. So
Mm-hmm.
this quarter's Unstuck Church Report focus specifically on financial and staffing trends because staffing obviously impacts finances as well.
Mm-hmm.
I was encouraged. We had over 400 churches take the survey in about a 15-day window. Those churches, by the way, were under 100 in attendance, all the way over to 20,000 in attendance. So it's a wide range of churches of different church sizes that are represented in this data. And the report will also look at some of the differences between small and large churches when it comes to financial and staffing trends.
Mm-hmm.
That information, we'll hit on a little bit of that today, but we aren't going to be able to take a look at all of the data and trends that we're seeing. And so if you haven't already, you will want to subscribe to our quarterly Unstuck Church reports. By the way, Amy, more than 10,000 church leaders are subscribed to that now. And if you want to subscribe, you can do that at the unstuckgroup.com/trends.
Over 10,000, Tony. That's amazing. Hey, Tony, the last I checked, we have like 25 people on our team at the Unstuck Group. And I think one of the advantages to being a smaller team is that we can quickly pivot, right, when circumstances or our mission demands it. So, focusing on the financial and staffing trends in this quarter report was an example of a recent pivot. Do you want to explain how that came about?
Well, I mentioned this in the report itself, but the recent conversations I've been having with pastors and church leaders have changed in recent weeks. You know, when I was talking with pastors at the end of 2021, there was often a sense of relief in the tone of their
Mm-hmm.
voices. Pastors felt like they had navigated the worst of the convergence of the pandemic, social justice crises, political division, and all of that obviously had impacted churches so much over the previous 24 months. But on top of that, many churches were in a strong financial position at that point
Mm-hmm.
about a year ago, and expenses were down through the heart of the pandemic. Some churches had taken advantage of the government loan grant programs, and giving throughout that period remained strong. So, in many instances, giving actually increased. And because of all
Mm-hmm.
of that, senior pastors were generally optimistic about what was coming next for their ministries. These were the common themes I was hearing maybe through Easter of this current year, Easter of
Mm-hmm.
2022. And then the conversations began to change. And I started to hear from pastors that giving was beginning to slow down. Many began to acknowledge that the offerings hadn't matched the forecasting that they had used to prepare their 2022 budget. And then inflation reports started to trickle in. And first, it started to impact the cost of living for people in our congregations. But then, obviously, it began to be reflected in the giving patterns as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings us to today. And the genesis of this special edition of the Unstuck Church Report came from a string of recent conversations I had with pastors through the last several weeks. And in these more recent conversations, pastors seem to be more concerned about giving declines. They started talking about the challenge of retaining key staff while knowing wage adjustments needed to take place to help families
Right.
facing higher living expenses. And many churches, just to be honest, they didn't adjust spending during the pandemic, so now they're dealing with the combination of rising costs and declines in giving. And as I reflected back on these most recent conversations I'd had with pastors, almost all of them were hinting at the need to reduce staff to
Mm.
overcome giving declines while trying to appropriately increase the wages of staff who they're hoping to retain. And Amy, that's what I was hearing. And that's why we changed our plans and invested the time we have over these last several weeks to do this research. So I hope this report helps you prepare for the conversations that you're probably having with your staff and lay leaders. I hope this helps you to make better decisions to set up your churches for health and greater kingdom impact in the new year.
Well, let's jump into the trends, beginning first with finances. What stood out to you, Tony, from the data we collected from those more than 400 churches?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about what the current trends that we're seeing, and then we'll look at what church leaders are projecting for the new year. So, as far as current trends, giving in the last month is up, but it's not keeping pace with inflation. I mean, not
No,
much
not
is
much.
keeping pace with inflation
They are in
right
the
now.
lead.
So yeah, the good news is giving is up by about 3.5%. But here in the U.S., anyways, in October, the reported inflation rate was 7.7%. So it's less than half of what we're experiencing as far as rising
Hmm.
cost here, at least in the U.S. And then, and related to that, per capita giving is flat over these last 5 years if you look at inflation adjusted data. So, first of all, let me explain how we calculate per capita giving. You may calculate it different, but we calculate it this way so that we can look at apples to apples data across all the churches that we're working with. We take a look at the number of adults and students that are attending services every week. Then we take a look at the offering totals, and essentially we divide the annual giving amount by 52 so that we get to a weekly amount. And then we divide that weekly amount by the weekly average attendance of adults and
Makes
students.
sense.
And when we do that, the average per capita giving across all churches is $65 per adult and student per week. And again, what's fascinating is if we look at that number and compare it to where we were 5 years ago, factoring in inflation, it's exactly the same amount. So the challenge here is that I, our expenses are growing. There's no doubt about it. They're growing faster than the giving is coming in, and so that's a challenge that we're currently dealing with. You may also be interested in knowing that churches invest about 70% of their budget in both staff and facilities. And the specific breakdown for staff expenses, they're spending on average 52% of their budget. And then related to buildings and facility expenses, they're spending 17% of their budget. And Amy, generally, I was
Hmm.
encouraged by that data. Both of those percentages are within the recommended ranges that we encourage churches to monitor on an ongoing basis when it comes to how they manage their money.
And if that's what churches are currently experiencing, what does the data tell us about how churches are preparing for 2023?
Well, it's probably no surprise, but church leaders are expecting that economic conditions are going to impact financial health for their ministries. In fact, of all the survey respondents, 58% said it's likely that economic conditions will impact financial health. And just to give you a sense, that was 5 times the number of respondents who predicted the economy would not
Hmm.
have an impact on their ministry's
Hmm.
finances. So, it's certainly the case that church leaders are aware of the financial constraints, challenges that we're facing, and how that may impact their ministries. So, with that, churches are projecting, though, that they will experience a 5% increase in giving in 2023. It's interesting, though, here again, differences between the largest churches that responded and the smaller churches. The largest churches were much more pessimistic about giving in 2023. They only are projecting a 2%
Interesting.
increase. And personally, if I was a betting man, which I'm not because I'm very shrewd with my money and I don't like to let go of it, especially if I think I'm just giving it away. But I would, if I were a betting man, I would put my money on the more conservative projections from the larger churches. But either way, the projected increase is still below where we are with current
Hmm.
inflation rates. So churches are going to experience what we're all experiencing. I think every one of us, we're thankful when we get the pay raise that we've just received. But in today's climate, with inflation where it is, that pay raise still feels like a
Yeah.
pay cut. And I think that's what churches are going to feel in the coming months. And so with that in mind, here's what I would encourage you to do. Don't use those projections. Instead, use your actual giving numbers that you've experienced over the last 12 months. So, if you're planning your ministry budget for 2023, I recommend you skip the forecasts for 2023 and instead plan to spend 90% of what you actually received over the last 12 months. That's a practice, by the way, that we see the healthiest churches we serve use every year, not just in times of economic uncertainty like we're
Hmm.
experiencing right now. And then let's say giving exceeds that 90% number and you end up with more money than you budgeted. Well, then you are in the enviable situation of having to decide how to invest that extra money in the mission of the church, either right now or into the future. And so I know jumping from where you are today to budgeting just 90% of what came in the last 12 months, that's a big leap. And many churches aren't able to do that in just one budget cycle. But maybe, let's just say over the next 3 budget cycles, we're going to take baby
Hmm.
steps to get to that place. But if you start to do that over time, when we hit our next economic downturn and giving starts to decline as well, you will be in a better financial position to be able to
Hmm.
navigate the challenges of the current financial season that we're in.